Friends, thank you for being here today. Before we begin, if you value in-depth analysis that respects your intelligence and refuses to sugarcoat the hard truths, please take a moment to like this video. It helps the algorithm push this warning to those who are still asleep at the wheel. We stand at a precipice in American economic history, a moment that future historians will likely mark as the definitive turning point between the era of American hegemony and the onset of the next Great Depression. This is not a statement made lightly, nor is it intended to incite panic. Rather, it is a conclusion drawn from a dispassionate analysis of the mathematical realities currently governing the United States' monetary system. The Federal Reserve has recently made a decision, a specific pivot in monetary policy that guarantees a trajectory toward the destruction of the American middle class. This was not a decision made out of malice, but out of necessity. They have been cornered by decades of fiscal irresponsibility, and when faced with the binary choice between immediate systemic collapse and prolonged, debilitating inflation, they have chosen the latter. To understand why this outcome is now inevitable, we must look beyond the daily fluctuations of the stock market and headlines of soft landings, to the fundamental mechanics of sovereign debt, the life cycles of fiat currencies, and the immutable laws of mathematics. The premise of this analysis is simple, yet terrifying. The United States is currently carrying over $38 trillion in national debt. For the first time in history, the interest payments alone on this debt have crossed the threshold of $1 trillion per year. To put that figure into context, the U.S. government now spends more on servicing its past debt than it spends on the entire Department of Defense. We spend more on interest than we do on Medicare. This interest expense is dead money. It builds no roads, educates no children, and defends no borders. It is simply the cost of renting the money we have already spent. In this environment, the Federal Reserve's recent decision to cut interest rates is the trigger. Conventional economic wisdom suggests that cutting rates is a tool to stimulate a slowing economy. However, in the context of high inflation and staggering debt, it signals something far more ominous, a capitulation. It signifies that the central bank has abandoned the fight for a stable currency because the alternative, maintaining high rates, would render the United States government insolvent and collapse the banking system. They are choosing inflation over collapse. They are choosing to slowly destroy the purchasing power of your savings rather than allow the illusion of solvency to shatter. I want to pause here and ask you a serious question. If you were sitting in the Federal Reserve chairman's seat right now, faced with this impossible choice, immediate collapse of the banking system or the slow destruction of the dollar, which would you choose? Pause the video and let me know your verdict in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious to see where you stand. This is the mechanism by which the next Great Depression will arrive, not through a deflationary crash where prices fall, but through an inflationary depression where money loses its meaning. To understand our current trajectory, we must first establish the framework that governs the life cycle of all fiat currencies. History is not a series of random events. It is a cyclical repetition of human behavior under similar incentive structures. Every major empire that has relied on a fiat currency, money backed by nothing but government decree, has progressed through 4 distinct stages. The cycle begins with stage 1, fiscal restraint. In this foundational stage, the currency is backed by something tangible, historically gold or silver. There's a direct correlation between the money supply and the physical assets held by the state. Trust in the currency is absolute because it is redeemable. During this phase, economies thrive on production, savings, and genuine capital investment. Society rewards prudence, and the middle class expands because the value of their labor is stored in a medium that holds its worth over time. This inevitably leads to stage 2, expansion and temptation. Success breeds confidence, and confidence breeds complacency. Inevitably, the state faces a crisis, a war, a pandemic, or a desire for massive social programs that requires more funding than taxation can provide. The constraints of hard money become politically inconvenient. The government loosens the peg to the tangible asset. Deficits become normalized. The central bank begins to step in as a buyer of government debt. During this stage, the economy often appears to be booming. The expansion of credit creates an artificial wealth effect. Stock markets rise, real estate appreciates, and the populace feels richer. However, this growth is illusory. It masks the underlying decay of the currency's purchasing power. Then comes stage 3, crisis and desperation, which is the stage the United States occupies today. The accumulated debt from stage 2 becomes mathematically unsustainable. The interest payments on the debt begin to consume a significant percentage of tax revenue. The central bank faces an impossible dilemma: raise interest rates to defend the currency and stop inflation, or lower interest rates to keep the government solvent and the asset bubbles inflated. Raising rates crashes the economy, lowering rates destroys the currency. In stage 3, volatility increases, social unrest begins to simmer, and the wealth gap explodes as asset holders are bailed out while wage earners are left behind. Finally, we arrive at stage 4, collapse and reset. This is the terminal phase. Having exhausted all other options, the government chooses to print money in exponential quantities to meet its obligations. This leads to either hyperinflation, where the currency loses all value, or a hard default, where the state admits it cannot pay. In both scenarios, the middle class is annihilated, savings evaporate, the social order fractures, the system resets, often through chaotic political upheaval or war. This framework is not theoretical. It is the historical record. If we examine the receipts of history, we see this exact pattern playing out across millennia, continents, and cultures. To claim that the United States is immune to these laws of economics is a manifestation of American exceptionalism in its most dangerous form. The laws of mathematics do not care about a nation's military strength or cultural export. We can verify this by examining 3 distinct civilizations that followed this exact script to their ruin. Let us look first to the Roman Empire and the debasement of the denarius. Rome was the greatest empire of the ancient world, controlling the entire Mediterranean basin. Its currency, the denarius, was the reserve currency of its time, trusted from the chaotic frontiers of Britain to the grain silos of Egypt. In stage 1, the denarius was a coin of high integrity, minted with 95% pure silver. This sound money facilitated trade, conquest, and the Pax Romana. However, as the empire expanded, so did its costs. The burden of maintaining legions on the frontier, combined with the domestic political necessity of providing bread and circuses to the populace, drained the treasury. The emperors could not raise taxes high enough to cover these costs without risking rebellion. So they chose the path of least resistance, debasement. Emperor Nero began the process, reducing the silver content to 90%. Subsequent emperors continued the trend, shaving off a little more silver with each new minting to fund their wars and monuments. By the time of Emperor Aurelian in the late 3rd century, the denarius contained less than 5% silver. It was a bronze slug coated in a thin wash of silver, a fraud masquerading as money. The economic consequences were catastrophic. As the quality of the money collapsed, prices skyrocketed. A measure of wheat that cost 8 drachmas in the 2nd century cost over 100 drachmas by the end of the 3rd. The government attempted to solve this with price controls, threatening death to merchants who charged market rates. The result was shortages. Merchants stopped selling. The complex trade networks of the empire disintegrated, and the economy reverted to primitive barter. The Roman Empire did not fall solely because of barbarian invasions. The barbarians merely kicked in a door that had already been rotted through by monetary collapse. Fast forward to the 20th century to see the destruction of the middle class in Weimar Germany. A common counter-argument is that modern industrialized nations are too sophisticated for such a collapse. The example of Weimar Germany in the 1920s disproves this notion entirely. Before World War I, Germany was a paragon of Western civilization, an industrial powerhouse, a leader in science and engineering, with a stable gold-backed currency and a disciplined central bank. World War I broke the system. To fund the war, Germany suspended the gold standard and borrowed heavily, gambling that victory would allow them to repay debts with the spoils of war. They lost. The Treaty of Versailles imposed crushing reparations, 132 billion gold marks, a sum that exceeded the nation's entire GDP. Faced with these impossible obligations, the Weimar government entered stage 3. They could not tax a war-torn population enough to pay the debt, so they printed. At first, the inflation was gradual, then rapid, and finally exponential. The statistics from this period remain some of the most terrifying in economic history. In 1921, $1 could buy 75 German marks. By November 1923, $1 bought 4.2 trillion marks. The currency did not just lose value, it ceased to function as a unit of measure. The societal impact provides the most chilling warning for us today. The hyperinflation did not hurt everyone equally. The industrial tycoons and those with foreign assets or borrowed money survived and even thrived. The devastation was concentrated entirely on the middle class. Teachers, civil servants, pensioners, and skilled laborers, people who had played by the rules and saved in cash bonds, saw their life's work reduced to nothing. A lifetime of savings could not buy a loaf of bread. This economic annihilation radicalized the population, destroyed faith in democratic institutions, and paved the way for the rise of extremism. A more contemporary example strikes even closer to home, debunking the idea that resource wealth guarantees stability. Venezuela. 20 years ago, Venezuela was the wealthiest country in South America. It sat atop the largest proven oil reserves in the world, more than Saudi Arabia, more than the United States. In stage 1, during the 1970s and 80s, Caracas was a modern metropolis. The middle class was vibrant and the currency was stable. Stage 2 began with the rapid expansion of socialist policies. The government nationalized industries, imposed price controls, and funded massive social programs using oil revenue. For a time, high oil prices masked the structural rot. But when oil prices crashed in 2014, the facade crumbled. The government, having destroyed its domestic production capacity through regulation and seizure, had no revenue. They turned to the printing press. The timeline of collapse was terrifyingly fast. Inflation hit 300% in 2017, and by 2018 it reached 1,000%. In a modern 21st century nation, grocery store shelves sat empty. Hospitals ran out of basic antibiotics. The average citizen lost 24 pounds of body weight due to malnutrition. 7 million people, nearly a quarter of the population, fled the country. This tragedy occurred not because Venezuela lacked resources, but because its government destroyed the currency. It proves that no amount of natural wealth can protect a nation from the consequences of bad monetary policy. The frightening reality is that the United States is following this exact historical script, step by step. Stage 1 ended on August 15, 1971. This was the date President Richard Nixon unilaterally closed the gold window, ending the Bretton Woods system. Prior to this, the US dollar was the global reserve currency because it was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Foreign nations held dollars because they were as good as gold. But the US had violated the rules of Stage 1. To fund the Vietnam War and Great Society programs, the US printed more dollars than it had gold. When France and other nations began demanding their gold back, the US defaulted on its promise. The dollar became a pure fiat currency, unmoored from any physical reality. Since 1971, we have been living in Stage 2. Without the discipline of gold, US debt exploded. In 1971, the total federal debt was roughly $400 billion. Today, it is over $34 trillion, an 8,700% increase. The real acceleration, however, occurred during the global financial crisis of 2008. The 2008 crisis was a natural breaking point, a moment where the system should have reset. Reckless banks should have failed and bad debt should have been liquidated. Instead, the Federal Reserve intervened with quantitative easing, a euphemism for money printing. The Fed created dollars out of thin air to buy government bonds and toxic mortgage-backed securities. They expanded their balance sheet from $800 billion to $4.5 trillion. They flooded the system with liquidity, driving up asset prices and saving the banks, but sowing the seeds for the inflation we see today. Then came the nuclear option during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. In response to the economic shutdown, the U.S. government and the Federal Reserve engaged in the largest money printing operation in human history. In just 3 months, the Fed printed $3 trillion, the U.S. money supply exploded. Checks were mailed to every household. Businesses received forgivable loans, and unemployment benefits were effectively doubled. While this prevented an immediate depression, it violated the laws of supply and demand. You could not increase the supply of money by 40% while the production of goods and services grinds to a halt without causing inflation. The result was the inflation spike of 2022, where CPI hit 9.1%. This brings us to the present moment, where the Federal Reserve is trapped in a prison of its own making. To fight the inflation they created, the Fed was forced to raise interest rates from 0% to over 5% in one of the fastest tightening cycles in history. This action exposed the fatal flaw in the system. The debt is too high to sustain positive real interest rates. When the government owes $34 trillion, every 1% increase in interest rates adds hundreds of billions of dollars to the annual deficit. As noted earlier, we are now paying over $1 trillion a year in interest. If rates were to remain at 5% or rise to 7%, a historically normal level, interest payments would consume the entire federal budget. The government would be forced to cut Social Security, disband the military, or default. None of these are politically viable options. Furthermore, the banking system is sitting on massive unrealized losses. Banks bought government bonds when rates were near zero. Now that rates are higher, the value of those bonds has crashed. We saw the cracks form in early 2023 with the failure of regional banks. These were not isolated incidents. They were tremors warning of a systemic earthquake. The entire banking sector is effectively insolvent if they have to mark their bond portfolios to market rates. This creates the Fed's dilemma. Keep rates high to fight inflation, thereby causing a sovereign debt crisis and mass bank failures, or cut rates to save the government and banks, thereby reigniting inflation and destroying the currency. The recent decision to cut rates confirms they have chosen option 2. They are pivoting back to easing even though inflation is not fully conquered. They are admitting that the U.S. government cannot afford its own debt. By cutting rates while running a $2 trillion annual deficit, the Fed is engaging in what economists call fiscal dominance. They are signaling that the central bank is now subservient to the Treasury. They will print whatever is necessary to keep the government funded. The world is watching, and the reaction leads us to the mechanism of de-dollarization. Foreign nations, which have financed American overconsumption for decades by buying U.S. Treasury bonds, are stepping away. China has reduced its holdings of U.S. debt by hundreds of billions. Japan is struggling to defend its own currency. The BRICS nations are actively building alternative payment rails. Saudi Arabia has ended its exclusive agreement to sell oil only in dollars. When foreign demand for U.S. debt dries up, who is left to buy the bonds? Only the Federal Reserve. When the Fed buys the government's debt, it is called debt monetization. It is the exact mechanism that destroyed the Weimar mark and the Venezuelan bolivar. It creates a closed loop where the government spends money it doesn't have, issues debt to cover the difference, and the central bank prints new money to buy that debt. This dilutes the value of every existing dollar in circulation. We are now barreling towards stage 4, and the most likely outcome is not a deflationary crash like 1929, but an inflationary depression. In a deflationary depression, prices fall, cash becomes king, and debt is wiped out through bankruptcy. In an inflationary depression, nominal prices rise, but real purchasing power collapses. The stock market may hit all-time highs in nominal terms, but those gains will not keep pace with the cost of living. We will see a phenomenon where the economy slows while prices rise, stagflation on steroids. The standard of living for the American middle class will plummet. Essentials, food, energy, housing, healthcare, will become unaffordable for the average wage earner. We are already seeing this. The cost of living crisis is simply a polite synonym for currency devaluation. I want to hear from you on this. We see the official CPI numbers, but we know the reality at the grocery store is different. What is the one item where you've seen the most shocking price increase in your area? Drop the item and the price change in the comments. Let Yes create a real-world inflation gauge right here in this community. The government will likely attempt to mask this reality with tools that have failed throughout history, such as yield curve control, price controls, capital controls, or even central bank digital currencies. Techno-optimists argue that AI and technological deflation will save us, that we will grow our way out of the debt. This is wishful thinking. While technology increases productivity, it cannot offset the exponential math of compound interest on $34 trillion in debt. Technology creates deflation in goods, but monetary debasement creates inflation in assets and essentials. You cannot eat an iPhone, and you cannot live inside a software subscription. To fully grasp the magnitude of the danger, we must look beyond the aggregate numbers and understand the specific mechanism of destruction, the Cantillon effect. Richard Cantillon, an 18th century economist, observed that where new money enters the economy is just as important as how much enters. When the Federal Reserve prints trillions, that money does not appear magically in the bank accounts of average Americans. It flows first to the primary dealers, the major banks, and the government. These first receivers of the new money get to spend it before prices have risen. They buy stocks, bonds, and real estate at yesterday's prices. As this money circulates through the economy, bidding up the price of goods and services, it eventually reaches the wage earner. But by the time it reaches you, in the form of a cost of living adjustment or a minor raise, prices have already skyrocketed. You're receiving depreciated currency to pay for appreciated goods. This is not an accident. It is structural theft. It is the greatest transfer of wealth in history, moving purchasing power from the saver and the worker to the borrower and the asset holder. This leads to a paradoxical economic state known to the Austrian economists as the crack-up boom, or Katastrophenhause. In this phase, the stock market does not crash, it melts up. We saw this in Weimar, Germany, where the stock market index rose into the trillions. A casual observer might have looked at the German stock market in 1923 and thought the economy was booming. In reality, the companies weren't producing more. The currency denominating their shares was simply collapsing. We are seeing the early stages of this phenomenon today. The disconnect between the stock market and the real economy is not a bubble in the traditional sense. It is a flight to safety. Investors are not buying the S&P 500 because they believe earnings will grow exponentially. They are buying it because they know cash is a liability. They are desperate to own anything that is not a dollar. However, for the middle class, this boom is a trap because wages are sticky. They are the last thing to rise in an inflationary cycle. The average worker falls further behind every single day, even as the news tells them GDP is growing and stocks are at all-time highs. This creates a psychological breaking point. When the public realizes that inflation is not transitory, but a permanent feature of the new regime, their behavior shifts. They stop saving. They begin to spend their paycheck the moment they receive it, not because they are wealthy, but because they know the money will buy less next week. This increase in the gain velocity of money creates a feedback loop that accelerates inflation beyond what the central bank can control. The government's response to this velocity spike will inevitably be financial repression. We must anticipate that as the bond market rebels, the authorities will implement measures to lock capital within the system. This could take the form of forcing pension funds to buy government debt, restricting withdrawals, or increasing capital gains taxes on the nominal, illusory profits of asset holders. The gains you make on your house doubling in price are not real wealth if the cost of bread has tripled, yet the taxman will treat them as profit. This is the final squeeze. The state inflating away its debt while taxing the citizens on the nominal effects of that inflation. It is a pincer movement designed to liquidate the middle class to preserve the sovereign. Recognizing that the Federal Reserve has triggered this sequence of events is not a call to despair, but a call to action. The greatest danger in stage 3 is normalcy bias, the belief that tomorrow will look like yesterday. It will not. The rules of wealth preservation that worked for the last 40 years are now inverted. To survive the coming transition, one must adopt a new strategic framework. First, you must abandon the illusion of cash safety. In a stable environment, cash is a risk-free asset. In an inflationary depression, cash is a melting ice cube. Holding large amounts of fiat currency in a savings account guarantees a loss of purchasing power. Liquidity is necessary for emergencies, but it should not be viewed as a store of wealth. Second, you must accumulate hard assets. The antidote to fiat devaluation is owning things that cannot be printed. Precious metals like gold and silver have served as the ultimate hedge against government incompetence for 5,000 years. Central banks are currently buying gold at record rates. You should follow their lead, not their words. Productive real estate also remains a tangible store of value, as rental properties can reprice rents to match inflation. Commodities, such as energy and industrial materials, are essential for civilization, and their nominal price invariably rises as currency weakens. Third, look for equities with pricing power. Not all stocks will survive. Companies dependent on cheap debt or consumer discretionary spending will be crushed. However, businesses that produce essential goods and services and possess the ability to raise prices without losing customers will act as an inflation shield. Focus on value, cash flow, and dividends over speculative growth. Fourth, invest in skills and adaptability. In a depression, unemployment rises. The most inflation-proof asset you possess is your own ability to generate value. Skills cannot be debased. Intellectual capital cannot be taxed away easily. Learning practical skills, from repair and trade work to digital competencies, provides a layer of security that a portfolio cannot. Adaptability is the primary survival trait in stage 4. Fifth, build resilient networks. When institutions fail, communities become the primary safety net. History shows that during the Great Depression and other crises, those with strong family and community ties fared significantly better than isolated individuals. Invest time in building relationships with neighbors, local producers, and like-minded individuals. The lone wolf mentality is a fantasy. In reality, survival is a group effort. Perhaps the most important step is psychological preparation. You must accept the reality of the situation. Denial is a powerful psychological defense mechanism. It is comforting to believe the government will fix it, that the Fed has a master plan, or that the debt doesn't matter. But hope is not a strategy. Accepting that the standard of living is likely to decline and that the era of easy money is over allows you to make rational decisions today that will protect you tomorrow. In conclusion, the Federal Reserve has made its choice. By cutting rates in the face of persistent inflation and record debt, they have signaled the end of the fight for the dollar's integrity. They have pulled the trigger on the next Great Depression, an inflationary unraveling of the American middle class. The trajectory is set. The math is undeniable. We are moving from the illusion of stage 2 into the crisis of stage 3, with the chaos of stage 4 looming on the horizon. This is not a time for fear. Panic paralyzes. This is a time for cold, calculated preparation. The window of opportunity to convert depreciating paper currency into real, tangible wealth is closing, but it is not yet shut. The transfer of wealth during this period will be massive. It will flow from the unprepared to the prepared, from the holders of paper to the holders of assets, from those who trust the system to those who understand the math. History has given us the receipts. The Federal Reserve has given us the signal. The rest is up to you. If you know someone who is still trusting the mainstream narrative, do them a favor and share this analysis with them. It might be the wake-up call they need before it's too late. Thank you.